Hey guys, it's me. Thanks for tuning in today in this midweek video for the week 10 as we continue to read through the Bible together. So just real quick before we even get started, my voice obviously sounds kind of weak, sounds kind of weird right now. I've gone between sounding like Barry White to sort of sounding like a robotic frog. Um, Earlier this week, I started feeling pretty rough. I went and tested yesterday for all of the viruses out there. Negative, feeling a little bit better, but still dealing with this annoying voice. And so hopefully it'll hold on through the whole video, getting better each day. And so I'll be okay by Sunday, but I'm sorry about this annoying thing that you've got to listen to right here. Super exciting week as we read entirely this week in the book of Numbers. Numbers starts off rough. Numbers starts off with God telling the people to have a census, or Moses to have a census of the people all 20 years and older, and then to know everything about those people groups and kind of setting them apart for different jobs and things like that. Last week we read about that beautiful blessing that Aaron is to place over the Israelites as God continues to prepare them to set them out on their journey. This week, picking up with Numbers chapter 7, it starts off with, it says that the tabernacle is built. And then immediately after that, we see that there's 12 different people that are set apart as the leaders of Israel, the leaders of their tribes, that bring the same exact offering to the Lord, to the tabernacle there. And so allow yourself, as you read through that offering, which is difficult to read, just to think about the value of that offering as you see that it's about 3 pounds of gold and 60 pounds of silver and all the other things that are there. So do some little mathematic calculations and just see the value of those offerings that God has provided for them to give back to them. That's a great lesson in itself right there. After that, God continues to give them lessons of how they're to orderly tear down and to rebuild the tabernacle, preparing them again for the travel that's going to come in the near future for them. God again reminds them that he is going to be their guide, saying that he'll lead them as he comes down on them like a cloud in the day and a fire by night. He says that the trumpets are going to be used to call everyone into the assembly, and sometimes just the leaders, depending on what the trumpet does. And so God's telling them how to reach out to each other and how to circle around and just preparing them for traveling through dangerous lands. And then in chapter 10, we finally get to this place that we've all been so excited about. In chapter 10, it's been 14 months since God has freed them from Egypt. But at this point, God says it's time. God lifts up from them, and they pack everything up. They begin to set out on the journey. They're traveling to the promised land, and it only takes them just a little short amount of time. As a matter of fact, in chapter 11, they immediately start complaining and grumbling against God. God is having none of it at this point. And it says that the judgment of God falls down like a fire, and that it burns the outskirts of the camp around them. They cry out to Moses saying, ask God to stop. God shows mercy. He does stop. And then what do? They start complaining again. They said, oh, we're so tired of this God-given food that he's given us. We wish we had meat. We wish it was as good as it was back in Egypt. And so Moses is he's had it. He goes to God, and we see this incredible time of honesty where God's like, Moses says, look, I'd rather you just kill me than let me strap these people on my shoulder and take them. I can't do it alone anymore. And so God says, I'm going to raise up some helpers for you. And God gives him some spirit-led helpers that come along and that help Moses. But God also tells them in this time, God says, I'm going to give these people meat, so much meat, and they will eat it. Meat that's running out of their nose, so much meat. And then Moses says, like, God, where are you going to find this much meat? We're in the desert. And God says, is my arm too short to bless you in the way that I want to? And so God brings down the quail. It's this incredible thing that God does. The people begin to eat it, and while it's still in their teeth as they chew, God again brings down punishment upon his grumbling people. After that, and Moses has now got some help, we see that sadly, even Moses' family is in on this. So we see Miriam, his sister, and Aaron, his brother. They're really just jealous against Moses because he's getting these accolades. And so they begin to complain and say, like, shouldn't we be like lifted up and high and lifted up too? And they really make it about Moses' wife, but that's not the thing. They're really jealous. God deals with them, and he calls them into the cloud where he's been meeting with Moses. And he says, how dare you talk about Moses? Normally I speak to people like this, but like Moses in chapter 12, verse 8, he says, I speak to him like this. I imagine that's going to be some questions as we arrive together on Sunday about chapter 12, verse 8. After that, we see that Moses says to send some spies into the promised land so that they can see what it's like. So 12 spies go in. They come back out. They've got these massive fruits, and they say it's a land bountiful in fruit and honey and milk, just like God said it would be. And Caleb and Joshua were like, we got this. God can do this. But the other 10 spies, they were like, oh, it's so scary. There's big, bad people there. And like, we can't defeat them. We can't take over this land, even though God has promised. But Caleb and Joshua remained faithful. So then we see something heartbreaking happen. God comes and he says, because of your lack of faith, because of your lack of trust in me and your doubt, He says, none of you who went over there, none of the Israelites who are wandering around in the desert are going to make it into the promised land, except for Caleb and Joshua. So the people are, of course, are heartbroken. God says that their children are going to make it in, the children that they're pretending to care about. And he says, nope, it's not going to happen. So like fools, the people says, well, we'll do it on our own. So they try to take the promised land in their own power, forgetting about God. And it says that they're beat down, beat back by their enemies. At this point, Moses' cousins, the sons of Korah, began to start some trouble, much like Miriam and Aaron did just a few months ago. And they said, well, is Moses the only one that's wise? Is Moses the only one that we should listen to? And so Moses and Aaron back away, and Moses asked God, he said, God, would you do a new thing to handle these troublemakers? And the ground splits open and swallows up the tribe, or the sons of Korah and their families. Incredible to see that God is anointing Moses in a whole new way at this point. After this, we see that Aaron, the first high priest, dies. One of my favorite stories in the scriptures in chapter 21. We see that as the people continue to grumble, that God sends upon them fiery serpents. It's one of the coolest stories in the scripture. We'll probably hear about that a little more as we go this week. And then after that, we see kind of the beginning of this process where this prophet named Balaam just becomes a fool. You hear me all the time talk about how a donkey talks, and we're getting to that story. And so lots going on this week. I think I've given Numbers kind of a bad rap because as I've read through this week, we've seen so much going on. Numbers is a really interesting, really adventurous book of lots of stuff happening. The one story that I wanted to share about today happened in chapter 10. So much happens in chapter 10. But one of the first things that we see there is that as the people are setting out across the promised land, Moses, so God has said, I'm going to lead you, I'm going to take you to this place. Moses' brother-in-law and his father-in-law are there. And Moses said this weird statement to his brother-in-law in chapter 10. He says, would you go with us and show us where we're to camp and where we should stop as we go in the desert? And just for a minute, we start to think, like, is Moses having some doubt right here? Because isn't God the one that's going to guide them? Isn't God the one that's going to tell them to stop and when to go? Why would Moses ask his brother-in-law to use his expertise of being a desert dweller on leading the people? But God, it's not spoken of and it's not written of in the way that it's a negative connotation. And God doesn't rebuke Moses for lacking faith, which we see God has no problem for rebuking people with a lack of faith. And so I started to think this. Oftentimes, God provides us with what we need before we're in the situation. God had brought back Moses' father-in-law and his brother-in-law to be there with Moses and the people before he ever set them out. Moses was just using one of the tools that God had provided to him as he's going to send him into the wilderness. His brother was a great desert dweller. His brother understood how to survive his brother-in-law understood how to survive in the desert. And so Moses is just using one of the gifts that God has given him before he even needed it as he goes into it. There's this great book by Kevin DeYoung called Just Do Something. So often we cry out to God saying, God, would you provide for me? God, would you give me wisdom? God, would you show me how? And in this book, Kevin DeYoung says, would you just use the wisdom that God has given you? So often God has given us what we need, wisdom, or what we need, finances, before we even need them. And so it's just using the gifts that God has already given us before he's called us to the journey that we're going on. So guys, so much happening this week. I hope that you're blessed and encouraged as you read through the book of Numbers. I am super excited. Hopefully I have a voice to share as we go through the book of Numbers this Sunday coming up together at 9 o'clock. So continue to pray, continue to ask yourself, what am I seeing about God? What am I seeing about people? What am I seeing about myself? And then bring those questions, bring those insights. It's going to be a fun Sunday as we look through Numbers 7 to 22 together. Again, I'm sorry about my voice, but we made it. You made it. Continue to pray for me. I'll be praying for you. And I'll see you guys Sunday morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you so much. I love you. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.